Um, Hello and welcome to Wholesome Monday, where we are deep diving into Nancy's mysterious letter. We are on chapter 6 now. And as always, if you don't have time to watch the video, you can click the link down in the description box and follow me on Spotify in audio format. If you were here with us last week, you remember we left off on our first chapter that did not end in a cliffhanger. Nancy went to the jeweler and was asked about the necklace, I believe, that someone had given her. A pin. It was a pin. I lied. She went to get her necklace fixed, and the jeweler asked her about a pin that somebody bought for for Nancy. So, without further ado, let's just dive right into chapter 7, which is called A Good Lead. "You look surprised," said Mr. Whittier. "I guess I gave away a secret." "Oh, it's all right," Nancy assured him without divulging what was racing through her mind. The pin might be going to Nancy Smith Drew, and here was her chance to find the heiress. Nancy did not reveal her thoughts, however. Smiling, she said, "I must confess I haven't the least idea who might be giving me a pin, but it sounds exciting. I don't suppose you want to tell me who he is?" The jeweler sighed. "I've told so much already, I guess it won't matter. He said his name was Mr. Nixon and that he is from out of town." Nancy was startled. Was he Edgar Nixon? Was he a friend of the heiress or some other Nancy Drew? "Maybe Edgar Nixon is going to give the pin to me, but there'll be some trick to it if he does," Nancy decided. Mr. Whittier looked at her quizzically. "You seem kind of worried," he remarked. "I'm sorry I said anything, and please, when Mr. Nixon hands you the pin, don't let on I gave away a secret." Nancy assured him she would not. Suddenly she smiled. "If this man is the person I think he is related to someone I know very well. Would you mind telling me what he looks like?" "Well, he's kind of handsome, you might say," Mr. Whittier replied. "Very thin and dark." "What was he wearing?" Nancy asked. She was not surprised to learn that the purchaser of the pin had worn a camel's hair coat and hat. In her mind, this settled it. The buyer was indeed Edgar Nixon, but where did she possibly fit in the picture? Mr. Whittier handed Nancy the necklace. "Come in again soon," he invited her. "I'll have all my Christmas things on display next week." His suggestion gave Nancy an idea. Recalling a remark her father had made, she said, "Mr. Whittier, in a magazine advertisement I saw a special kind of cufflinks I know my dad would like. They were large gold squares and had diagonal stripes of black across them. I'd like a set to give Dad for Christmas." "I know the pattern well," said Mr. Whittier. "I'll order a pair if you like." "Please do, and let me know when they come in." "Speaking of cufflinks," said the jeweler, "Mr. Nixon bought a pair for himself. Kind of flashy, but he seemed to like them. They were bright red and had a black star in the center." Instantly Nancy thought what an excellent identification this was. Aloud she said, "I don't think I'd care for them myself." Shortly thereafter, Nancy left the shop and walked to her convertible. Deep in thought, she had just picked up 2 good leads. Nancy went directly to the Skeets' home on Cottage Street. Although it was not far from the Drews, she had never been in this particular area. The houses were rather shabby, many of them needing paint, but they were neat and the windows glistened. The small lawns in front of them were well kept, and Nancy drove slowly until she came to number 22. The bell knob on the Seaman's cottage door was brightly polished. In answer to Nancy's ring, the door was opened by a grizzled elderly man. "Howdy," he said, smiling affably. "We don't want to subscribe to any magazines, thank ye." "I'm not selling anything," Nancy laughed. "I came to see Mrs. Skeets." "Well, she hoisted anchor here about an hour ago," he said. I expect she just rode around to the chandler for some supplies, and most likely she'll be back by 6 bells. Nancy grinned. You mean 11 o'clock, Mr. Skeets? Call me Sailor Joe like the rest of the folks. He grinned broadly. Yes, miss. 6 bells on a ship is 11 o'clock. Then your wife will be back very soon, Nancy said, glancing at her wrist watch. May I wait? Heave your anchor, lass, Joe said. Come into the parlor. Chuckling, he led Nancy into the living room. It was papered in deep red and furnished in a variety of shabby furniture. On the walls were pictures of ships, a broken but highly polished sextant, a leather-looking spear, and a large dried starfish. Nancy sat down on a couch and remarked, Sailing all over the world, you must have seen many interesting things, Mr. Skeets. Aye, and so I have. Sailor Joe grinned, setting himself in a captain's chair. Why, a funny thing happened to me one time when I had shore leave in Melbourne, Australia. For fun, I told one of the dock hands I was a pearl diver, and me not being able to swim a stroke. That night, after I'd gone to sleep, somebody came and carried me away. Next thing I knew, I'd been shanghaied onto a boat that was really going pearl diving. Sailor Joe laughed uproariously. Nancy wondered what was so funny about this. Instead, it seemed tragic. I see you don't understand the joke, the old salt went on. You see, where I was brought up, us sailors meant washin' dishes when we said pearl divin'. The old man rocked with laughter and slapped his knees with great calloused hands. Nancy laughed too, but did not want Joe to get started on another one of his sea yarns. She was eager to ask him some questions before his wife returned. How long have you lived here? She asked. Maybe a year, maybe 2, Joe said. My old woman moved out here so I'd be far from the sea and maybe stay home more. But I could smell salt water if I was in the middle of the desert. Speaking of deserts, I must tell you. Nancy interrupted quickly. Did you ever know a young woman by the name of Nancy Drew? Nancy Drew? Well, I'll say I did. And a trim little figurehead she was, and as neat as an admiral's cutter. Did you know her? Nancy shook her head. I'm trying to locate a Nancy Smith Drew who's wanted in England, she said. Sailor Joe whistled. Wanted in England, is she? And for what? That girl never did a wrong in her life. Oh, she isn't wanted by the authorities, Nancy hastened to say. A relative died and left her some money. Aha! That's a jib of another cut, Joe grinned. Yes, Nancy Smith Drew used to room with my missus in New York. She kept a roomin' house then. Well, I'm glad Miss Drew come into some money, for she was hard up, that she was. Studying for the stage, and a fine figure of an actress she'd a made, tall and beautiful, with a fine, deep voice. Nancy was excited. Where is Nancy Smith Drew now? Sailor Joe went on. She couldn't get to sign with no theater, and at last she left us to go to some beach with a family as a governess. Nancy was wildly elated at this clue. When was this? She asked. Oh, that was maybe 10. No, not that long. Let me see now. I remember I brought her back a souvenir, and she was gone when I docked. What did I bring her? You'd never guess. A little monkey. I got it from a Portuguese down in Brazil. I'd made a voyage to Rio why, I remember now. It was just 8 years ago next spring that Miss Drew left us. 8 years ago? Nancy's heart sank. Do you remember the name of the family she went with? She asked. Sailor Joe pursed his lips and frowned. Presently, he said. English folks, I think. Name of Hilt something, or was it Washington? You know what? I gave that monkey to a man in exchange for a pair of boots. As the old man burst into laughter again, Nancy felt more encouraged than ever now that she had found another clue. Her thoughts were interrupted by an exclamation from Joy. Ahoy! Here comes the missus now. I know her step on the quarter-deck. He jumped to his feet and rushed to open the door for Mrs. Skeets. Her arms were loaded with bundles. Brisket corned beef is what you'll get for supper because it's the cheapest cut in the market, the woman announced. Salt horse again, exclaimed her husband. Well, never mind. We got company. Mrs. Skeets walked into the living room and saw Nancy. Humph, it's you, is it? She sniffed. Without another word, she passed through to the rear of the house, and it was some minutes before the woman returned. Did you bring the money? She asked. Hey, what's all this palaverin' about? Joe demanded in annoyance. This is the young lady who's responsible for the disappearance of the letter from your sister that had $10 in it. I went around to her house. I suppose you've got the money with you? Joe looked from his wife to Nancy in bewilderment. But this young lady didn't steal the money, did she? I'm asking no questions, Mrs. Skeets said stiffly. All I want is our $10. Nancy smiled at Sailor Joe. I'm glad you don't think I stole the money, she said. Of course I didn't. A batch of letters was taken from our house, and your wife seems to think that a letter from your sister was among them. Well, I ain't going to let you pay 1 cent, Joe roared. Not even a stevedore would agree to that. Nevertheless, I made a bargain with your wife, Nancy told him. I said I would give her the $10 in exchange for some information about Nancy Smith Drew. You see, Mrs. Skeets said loftily. Well, a bargain's a bargain. Let me see the $10 and then I'll talk. Nancy took the money from her purse and held it up. She told the woman of the conversation that she had had with her husband. I understand that Nancy Smith Drew was engaged as a governess by some English people several years ago. That's right, but Joe told you too much. Course this was a long time ago, and I don't think it'll do you much good trying to find Nancy Smith Drew there. The name of the people was Wilson, and they was staying at the Breakers Hotel somewhere on Cape Cod. Nancy turned over the $10 bill and started for the door. Thank you both for the information. I shall try hard to find this other Nancy Drew. Mrs. Skeets, ask your husband to tell you about her inheritance. As soon as Nancy reached home, she consulted the long-distance operator in order to dial the Breakers Hotel on Cape Cod. Finally, she was given the number and put in the call. The man who answered said the place was closed for the winter. He was only the caretaker. I'm trying to locate people named Wilson who perhaps spend the summers there, Nancy said. Could you give me their winter address? No, the man replied. I don't know the names of the summer guests, and all the hotel's books are locked up. Maybe if you call next summer, you can find out. Nancy put down the phone and stared into space. Once more she had run into a stone wall. How should she proceed now? As she sat lost in thought, the phone rang. She picked up the instrument and said, Hello. Hi, Nancy. Ned! How's everything? Ned Nickerson asked. You mean about the weekend? Just fine. Bess and George and I are driving up on Friday. We'll come right to Omega Chi Epsilon House, okay? That's what I was going to ask you to do. You girls will be staying here. Ned, Nancy said, I'm busy solving 2 new mysteries. She went on to give him a detailed account of Edgar Nixon, the stolen mail, and finally, the mysterious letter which had come from England for Nancy Smith Drew. At the end, she laughed and said, Of course I expect your help. It was Ned's turn to chuckle. I might be able to help you sooner than you think. You know there's to be a play Friday night, one of Shakespeare's. The Dramatic Society engaged a coach to come out from New York especially for it. She's a woman, and her name is N. Smith Drew. And that is the end of chapter 6. I feel like that was a really good chapter. A lot happened in not a lot of time. Seems like most of the chapters are around 10 pages, like 9 to 10 pages. There was, I think, the one chapter where a lot didn't happen, but I feel like quite a bit happens. I wonder if in the revisions they really pulled together a lot of the plot lines to move everything a little bit quicker. One thing I did want to talk about this chapter that is quite a running theme, I suppose, is the tell signs of when the character is Edgar Nixon, which is the camel's hair, coat, and hat. And this does specifically feel like a plot device that was used by the writer to give Edgar Nixon's character a very specific tell sign of who he is, which can be quite an effective plot device. I feel like, especially because these are children's books, I find that that would probably be pretty effective, especially when you think of the way a child's brain works when it's reading the brain, when like the child is reading. Not me referring to children as brains. But I do feel like that is a plot device specifically that was used so when the kids read the book, they have a specific thing to link to Edgar Nixon. I don't know if something like that would work as well in an adult book, but I do feel like in a children's book it is quite effective. And I feel like other stories do that as well, especially if you think of like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, how they describe the White Witch. She has very specific tell signs, very specific things about her that when she's described, you immediately know that she is the White Witch. So the reader, who is most likely in elementary school, immediately knows and can deduce themselves, essentially, oh yeah, that's Edgar Nixon. So it's almost like it's bringing the child into the story and helping them be a little bit of a detective too. And I do feel like that was one of the things about the Nancy Drew books that I liked as a child, is I also got to be a little bit of a detective. As Nancy found the clues, or as Nancy talked to people, she was putting the clues together, but so was I. And I feel like that's a very effective way to engage your reader into the story, is by bringing them along into the mystery as well. So you sort of feel, what's the word I'm looking for? Clever. And you can also feel like you are participating in the story. I feel like that's another way that you can engage your reader without writing a reader stand-in. For example, a lot of comments you will hear about the Harry Potter series is Harry Potter as a character is written as a stand-in for the reader. So he doesn't really have a lot of opinions on things, and his friends around him are the ones that tend to have the opinions, because the opinions of Harry are the opinions of the reader themselves. You are inserting yourself into the story as Harry Potter, who is coming into this world of magic and mystery. Whereas here in the Nancy Drew book, Nancy Drew is her own character, and you are like a passenger in the car in the story with her, going through with her as she finds new clues, as she gets excited about new clues, as she finds new things. You are also doing the same thing with her. You are having your deduction moments, and you are feeling clever, and you are getting excited because as she is unraveling the mystery, you as the reader are also unraveling the mystery. You can still have your character be their own person, their own character within the story, but you can also engage your reader in the story as well. What kind of examples can I give in adult stories? I feel like I don't have a lot of like adult mystery stories, I feel. I suppose to give some old school examples would be Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie. They're more adult mysteries. But even if you think of The Tale of the Orient Express, even, that's Agatha Christie, right? I'm pretty sure that's Agatha Christie. I'll double check and I'll put it up here. If I am incorrect, or if I'm right, I will write it right up in here. But if you think of specifically, one of the more popular mysteries, there has been a murder on the train and they are trying to find who is the murderer, and in an effort to not give spoilers, it ends up being this whole to-do of who actually murdered that person. And as the reader, when you're going through and reading this mystery and following the clues of the inspector, you are doing the same thing essentially that a child would be doing while reading a Nancy Drew book, which is going through the clues, asking your own questions, taking in and reviewing the evidence, and then coming to your own conclusions as you read. And as you read, the things that you conclude may or may not change throughout the story as new clues present themselves. Another example I could probably give, while this isn't necessarily an adult example, would be the Phoenix Wright game series, where Phoenix Wright is a lawyer and you're going through the story trying to find clues, and then you're, as Phoenix Wright, trying to prove in court whether the defender or whoever, you're trying to find who actually did the bad thing. So all of these are engaging the player, they're engaging the reader, essentially bringing them into the story as their own player character. And so back to what I was originally saying about Edgar Nixon having very specific tells of who he is. In children's literature especially, this is a great way to sort of give the child that feeling of also being clever and figuring things out without making it so obvious. So yes, how to engage your reader as a character in the story itself. And then you get another lovely, wholesome thing where Nancy asks about the cufflinks. She remembers a remark her father made and asks about these specific cufflinks that she wants to get him for Christmas. How sweet is that, though, actually? I feel like I also do that as a child. I will pay attention to things that my parents say they need or want. Especially my mom, she'll make these like offhanded comments of like, oh, I need to get this or I need to get that. And then in the back of my mind, I'll just tuck it away for whatever occasion, birthday, Christmas, things like that. And that's one way to get ideas for the holidays, if that is something that you celebrate. Oh yeah, and then she gets, because of that, she gets the extra clue of the cufflinks that Mr. Nixon bought. So that's another tell sign. And she even comments on what an excellent identification those cufflinks are to confirm, because even if Edgar Nixon wasn't wearing the camel's hair jacket and hat, for example, if they were going to a dance and he was just wearing a suit, those cufflinks would be a great way to identify him in whatever suit jacket he's wearing. So this almost feels like it's setting us up as the reader for later on when we are going to encounter Edgar Nixon when he's not in his camel's hair outfit. He's going to be wearing these cufflinks. And that is another thing, again, that as an adult, I can break that down and I can foresee that. But as a child, I didn't. So then I'm learning about this second tell sign for Edgar Nixon. When we get to that part, wherever it happens to be in the story, as a child, the writer is going to mention those cufflinks and I'm going to put two and two together and I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, that's Edgar Nixon. Like, I totally just solved who this person was. And you get that really exciting feeling of you being clever and figuring things out, which also makes you want to keep reading the story because you want to continue to solve the mystery as it goes along. And then I love Sailor Joe as a character. This is another great thing for a fairly removed secondary character. He has a lot of characterization as a sailor through his dialogue, through the way that his home is decorated, through his stories that he tells from when he was a captain or a sailor. Even from the way that Nancy says he sits down in the captain's chair. And the way that he is always wanting to tell her all of these stories and she is having to interrupt him to ask the questions. Who's been there, though, for real? When you're trying to talk to someone about something important to you and they keep interrupting you to tell them stories of something completely unrelated and you're like, no, back on topic. Like, hey, back on topic. I need to ask you about this thing. I feel like that's something very relatable. And maybe that's just me as an ADHDer who interacts with other ADHDers and we get off on these tangents. But I did find it kind of an endearing quality, especially the way if you just read, the old man rocked with laughter and slapped his knees with great calloused hands. That's such a great image in one sentence sum up of this man who is not even a main character and probably will not be in the rest of the story, or if he is anywhere in the story, will not be in it much. And we get such great characterization in this one chapter. Nancy felt more encouraged than ever now that she had found another clue. Nancy finds a lot of clues in this chapter, and you can really sense her excitement coming through the page. I found when I was reading it, I myself was also getting excited about the clues that she was finding, which is another great tell of the story engaging you in the mystery along with Nancy. You are the passenger in this car ride that is the story and the plot, and Nancy is bringing you along on that ride, and you guys are going through everything together as a team. And then Nancy hands over her $10 bill, her extorted $200, she just hands over to Mrs. Skeets. I feel like this is good characterization again from Nancy. It's showing that she's a woman of her word. And again, going into that whole like kindness and the way that Mrs. Skeets and Sailor Joe are described, they're clearly very not well off, and Nancy is. So it seems like $10 isn't really a lot to her, but it is a lot to Mrs. Skeets and Sailor Joe. So Mrs. Skeets is saying a deal is a deal, and Nancy Drew agrees. A deal is a deal. I told your wife that if I got the information that I would give her the $10. So here is the $10. And really, Nancy didn't actually need to do that. Nancy talked to Sailor Joe. Sailor Joe did not know about the meeting that Mrs. Skeets and Nancy had had the day before. Nancy could have asked Sailor Joe all of that information and could have jet. She could have been, see ya, I'm off now. I got the information I needed. I got these great clues, and now I can go solve the mystery. But that's not Nancy Drew. That's not her character. Her character is very much one of high moral standing. She is a woman of her word. She is kind. She is caring. She wants to help people. And she believes that she's doing good things when she's solving mysteries. I guess what I'm trying to say is it is another way that the writer is showing Nancy's personality and Nancy's character through her character actions within the story itself. It's not stilted. It doesn't seem weird. It's very flows with the plot and with the story, and is just another way that we see Nancy being Nancy. And then we finally get to meet Ned over the phone. I don't know, there's a lot of exclamation points. I will try to show you. I don't know if I can show it because my light is here. Down here at the bottom, if it is showing, you can see there's a lot of exclamation points there. Hi, Nancy! Exclamation point. And then Nancy's just Ned! Exclamation point. Very excited to hear from each other. And this is the first time in 6 chapters that we have come across Ned. He's been mentioned very slightly in passing, but finally we are getting their interaction on the phone, and she says, I'm busy solving 2 new mysteries. Of course, I expect your help. And he kind of has this little laugh and then gives her another big clue. So this chapter called A Good Lead should really be called Several Good Leads. But it's getting Nancy excited and therefore the reader engaged and excited in the story for what's coming next. And that's the end of the chapter. And I think that's pretty much all I have to say on that. I guess this is my time for the outro. So that is all for chapter 6. If you would like to see what else I do around on the internet, I have a Linktree. I have a Patreon where I post spicier stories that would not be allowed on YouTube. And if you are interested, you can check those out. Otherwise, I will see you guys all next week for chapter 7. Bye! Hello, This is End Card Alley. Big thank you to all my patrons. Your support gives me the ability to pursue these passions. If you're not sure where to go from here, you can check out one of my other videos. There should even be a suggestion on screen right now. If you want to stay up to date, you can smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. I'm also part of the Arete Media Pantheon. I highly recommend you check them out at the link if you're looking for a new podcast to dive into. They've got a little something for everyone. If you're a millennial like me with a passion for literature, you might enjoy the Goosebumps podcast. There's Broadway, there's movies, there's even Star Trek. And with that, I will see you all in the next video.